Let me begin by saying this. I've had encounters with these creatures since I was young. To be exact, the first encounter I had was when I was 6 years old. It was a late night, and I had a strange creepy feeling that someone was watching me. Now, being 6 years old, I was scared of the dark, I guess like most young kids. It was dark in my room, and I was lying in bed for about 10 minutes trying to sleep. But I just couldn't. I had this urge to look out my window, which my bed was up against at the time. But when I looked out the window, I was startled to see 3 pairs of yellow eyes looking right at me. I screamed and ran downstairs to my mother. She went up the stairs to my room and looked out the window as well, but nothing was there. She told me that they were just cats, or maybe a couple of wild dogs. This made me feel better for a time, but I still felt like something was off. The next few experiences happened at my grandparents' house. For a long time I stayed there due to family matters, but the whole time I was there, I would hear these howls. It happened so often in the middle of the night, I got used to them, but then they would get closer and closer every week. And soon enough, to my explicit horror, I would hear scratching at my room's one window. But I always had the blinds closed, so I didn't see what was out there, and I hope it couldn't see me. But something tells me, whatever was there, it knew I was in that room. After some of my family issues had been solved, I had went back to live with my mom, and nothing happened for about 1.5 years. Eventually I went back to my grandparents, but the creature that lived in those woods never left the back of my mind. Once I went to stay with them for a weekend, as my grandfather had planned to go hunting with me. But while I was staying there, I didn't know I'd had the longest night of my life. You see, I'd fallen asleep in bed, and after a while I was awakened by my grandparents' cat Millie, scratching at my bedroom door and meowing. So I let her in about 15 minutes later, cause she just wouldn't stop. But only a few minutes after that, she was tired of being in my room, and I had to let her back out. But a few moments after I opened the door and I was walking back to bed after the cat left the room, I heard a deep, deep growl. The cat looked straight at the glass door which leads outside, and I looked as well, seeing the same yellow eyes from long ago, the same color, the same size, the same shape. That memory was scarred into my mind. I wouldn't forget something like that. But that night, I saw more than just yellow eyes. Just beyond that glass door, peeking into the house, I saw what looked like a wolf, but standing on 2 legs. Its head was bushy with fur, but its body was massive, as if the thing had been lifting weights for years. The cat hissed, which provoked this creature, and it growled. It put its hands right up on the glass, and then, before my very eyes, the creature made a sudden move for the door hinge. I froze, and then the thing tried to open it, but thank God, it was locked. The creature then backed away into the darkness, locking eyes with me as it did. I was petrified looking into those eyes. As soon as I couldn't see it anymore, I ran to my room, locked my bedroom door the rest of the night, but I couldn't sleep, because the tapping and scratching at my window wouldn't stop. Not to mention I couldn't help but thinking that this thing was intelligent enough to know how to open a door. That night I heard growling outside as well. The growling was so deep and loud, it shook in my chest. My window was 7 feet off the ground, and just faintly beyond the curtains, I could see a shadow being cast at the window by the one streetlight outside. I knew it was the creature, and had the same bushy head and pointed ears as the thing before. If I didn't know any better, it would have looked like a large dog was pawing up against my door. Eventually, that shadow faded away, and I heard stepping going back into the woods. That was a long night. The next morning, I asked my grandparents if they'd heard something, anything, but they said no, and it freaked me out, because how could they not hear that growling, the scratching, the howls? I never told them the full story, and I didn't want them to think that I was crazy. So now I sit here wondering, what was it that I saw? The werewolves from the movies, they can't be real, right? What scares me the most is that I feel like this won't be the last time I'll see this thing, and honestly, some morbid part of me wants to come face to face with it. but I highly doubt I'll come out of that situation alive. I'm 14 years old and I live in eastern Kentucky. Now, I'm not going to say the county I live in, but it's basically no man's land. We don't have a town, a restaurant, or anything like that. It's basically all mountains, so naturally we play in those mountains all the time. Now, this incident occurred when I was 9 years old. Me and 3 other friends were out gathering sticks, logs, and twine to build a fort with. About 2.5 hours later, we'd finished it. It was nothing special, but it wasn't small. So we ran back to our house to get cap guns, which we were going to use to play war with. We gathered 7 cap pistols and 11 cap rifles. Oh yes, we had a lot of those things. But when we got back to our fort, it was torn down. So we rebuilt it and played until sundown. But it's the next day when everything goes terrible. We were walking up the trail to the fort. When we finally got there, we were terrified at what we found. Our fort was intact this time, but we saw something. It had the body of a person up to the belly, but then from the rest up, this thing was a goat. It was sitting on its knees, and there was something lying in front of it. We stood there for at least 2 minutes, frozen in place by fear, until one of us made a noise like a whimper, and the thing then turned around. Its head and face, of course, were like a goat, and then this thing proceeded to stand up. I may be biased on this because I was short then, but it seemed like this thing was at least 6 feet tall. It began walking towards us, and being the kids we were, we started firing our cap guns at it. These caps were extremely loud, and we hoped that it would scare the thing. Apparently, it didn't like the loud, piercing noise, so it turned and ran away back into the mountains. Turns out this thing was eating a freshly killed buck. I'll never forget the look of that deer's face. It was frozen in horror. Its eyes were wide and stuck that way, and its mouth was frozen in a constant scream. We didn't stay there much longer. We ran back to the house as fast as we could, and stayed indoors the rest of the day. The whole time we avoided any windows. I haven't told many about this story, because the first person I did tell laughed at me. I did some research after the incident, and found out that it may have been the Goat Man, a creature that's been spotted around these parts quite a lot. And I hope I never see the thing again. We still go up there every now and then. Sometimes we go to hunt, but we're always sure to bring our rifles and muzzle loaders.
Back in 2008, I was on a hunting trip with my brother up near the Canadian-Michigan border. We had rented a cabin for a week, and we were looking forward to a nice quiet week until this monster spoiled it all. One night, after a day of being in the woods, we were tired and didn't feel like cooking up a meal, so I decided to jump in my truck and drive into town to get some pop and some grub, while my brother stayed back to wash up. So, I drove into the town by myself, and was away about 45 minutes, probably not even a solid hour. I talked with the gal at the counter for a few, but I wanted to get back to feed my brother, since he gets grouchy when he doesn't have food, and I didn't want him to be hacking on me. By the time I headed back, it was getting dark, and by the time I reached the cabin, the sun had already gone down all the way. I hit the road leading to the cabin and could see the silhouette of something big, looking in one of the windows of the cabin. At first, I thought it was Everett, since it looked like it was standing on 2 legs. But this thing looked to be too tall. So, then I thought to myself, well, then it's a bear. I didn't want no bear coming around the cabin and causing trouble, so I decided to scare him off with my headlights. So I aimed my truck in his direction and flipped on my high beams. What I saw then wasn't a bear, it was a monster. When my lights hit it, it spun around and I saw the whole thing, and it was only standing on 2 legs. Now, you wanted my description of this thing, and I wish I had my camera handy so I could have just took a picture and gave it to you, but I wasn't expecting to see any type of monster out there. He was a big guy, like Harry from Harry and the Hendersons, but it wasn't any Sasquatch I was looking at. It looked more like a werewolf. He was more than 7 feet tall, based on how high his head was above the top of the window. He was brown, like a chocolate lab, but the coat was different. It was shaggy like a wolf and had lighter spots in the chest and legs. He had big muscles, like he went to the gym. His chest was really wide and his shoulders looked like Brock Lesnar, a real musclehead. He had arms that looked like they could kill you easily, and these long, finger hands with big nails at the ends, and his neck was as thick as my waist almost. Even with all the power in his body, that ain't what scared the hell out of me. It was his face. He looked like he was madder than hell about something. Maybe because I interrupted him. Maybe that was just his attitude all day. Who knows? But those eyes, they will haunt me all my days. I believe in good and evil, and this thing was pure evil. The light reflected off his eyes like a night predator, and the rest of his face looked like a wolf's snout, teeth, nose, ears, and all just like a wolf. When this thing spun around to face me, it pivoted on his two back legs and turned just like a human would. First, he turned his waist to look at me, then pivoted faced me entirely. My body went numb and I started to shake. What in the hell was this thing? A werewolf? I don't know. The only thing I could think was that it was trying to get to my brother, and he didn't have any idea what this thing was. So, I started honking my horn and flashing my lights to get it to try to go away. Then that thing put its hands over its eyes to cover it like a person would. It gnashed its teeth at me and then ran off into the woods, and it was still on two legs. I pulled right the hell up to the cabin as close as I could, grabbed my mag light and ran into the door. Left the truck running and I was calling to my brother like a crazed man. Everett ran to a living room yelling at me, asking what the hell I was doing. And I told him something was out there and we had to leave now. Luckily, my brother's a trusting man. 43 years of living with me, he should know when I'm serious, right? So we grabbed our rifles and mag lights and took off into the truck with haste. As we ran to the truck, we could both hear something big running in the woods next to the cabin, and the loudest growl I've ever heard. That growl almost shook my insides. We tossed the guns to the truck and jumped in. Everett was shining his light to the forest, but he didn't see anything. Then we took off, and we got the hell out of there. On the way back into town, I told my brother what I had seen, and he just shook his head. I think he was letting it soak in. He looked at me and said, "Ard, I think you saw yourself a werewolf." I looked up to the sky, and it wasn't a full moon. I don't know what I saw that night. We went back during the day a few days later. After going to church, I might add, and praying a lot. We got our stuff and then talked to the gentleman that rented us the cabin and told him what I had seen. He swore that he had never heard of anything like that around that before, but I got the impression he was lying to us. That's why I never go into the woods alone or unarmed anymore.
This may seem far-fetched, and you may think it sounds a little crazy, but here goes. I'm not crazy, by the way. There's a lot of context behind this to tell my mentality, that what I saw was not a form of sleep paralysis. The first time I saw a UFO was 10 years ago. I saw it with my sister. It was triangular and had white lights under each corner. The interaction alone was weird enough, but I don't want to dive too much into it. Essentially, I have had experiences with alien crafts and paranormal things, though you guys should know at first, I didn't believe in these things. I thought they were just weird coincidences. Now back to what happened. Last year, in 2017, sometime in November, I took a trip to a games convention. A group of friends and I rented out a motel room while we were down there for a week. This happened on the first night we were there. I was sleeping in the same bed as my partner at the time. Now, I have had experiences in sleep paralysis my entire life. I don't think anyone could convince me otherwise, that what I saw was anything to do with sleep paralysis. I remember, obviously, sleeping, but I don't remember any dreams. Out of nowhere, I suddenly woke up, but I didn't open my eyes. I had this strange and odd feeling about my surroundings. I knew immediately something wasn't right. Still with my eyes closed, I felt this pressure on the side of my head. I was sleeping on my left side. It was right at my temple, and it felt like someone was pushing their finger onto it. While this was happening, simultaneously I remember answering questions. I don't know what they were, but I was responding and giving answers. It felt as though it was through my subconscious. In my head, I saw this blast of color from a dark void. It looked like gas clouds. Many clouds, actually. Colors of orange, white, and purple. I think those were the colors anyway. It also had stars through it. That alone freaked me out. I couldn't move at this point, and my eyelids were incredibly heavy. As I started to attempt to open my eyes, I could see something standing right next to me. I looked up as much as I could, and to my horror, that's when I saw it. Right next to me, this big black-eyed alien was staring at me. The motel room was dark, but from what I saw, this being had greenish-brown reptile-like skin. It didn't look like a crocodile, but you could tell it was reptilian. It had massive, black almond eyes, slanted upwards, and had a small head. It didn't exceed too far beyond his eyes. He had this suit on, which was changing colors, almost like he managed to get into some sort of morph suit. Think of kind of like Mystique from the X-Men. Needless to say, I freaked the heck out. My first reaction was to fight it off. I managed to lift my arms as much as I could and started to sluggishly fight it off. I backed away slightly and turned to the left, then proceeded to walk down towards the end of the bed. He was only around 4 feet tall. It felt as if my entire body was vibrating, not the kind of vibration you get from a PS4 controller. It was like a bass from a car. I felt heavy. My entire body was vibrating, but I still managed to lift myself up from the bed and sit up straight. If I had to put another feeling to it, it felt like I was drugged, like someone had 2 low speakers on either side of me blasting it, causing me not to be able to move. As I got up to the top to see where the alien went, I backed out, woke up instantly afterwards, feeling rested and still in the same position as I was when I had my interaction with the alien. My boyfriend said he didn't feel or see anything at night, but he believed me. Needless to say, my mentality broke after that. I got into a severe depression, and my anxiety was so bad, I started to contemplate suicide. In 1992, I rented a house in Fredericksburg, Virginia, following several years of living abroad. It was a rather pleasant house, a ranch design, in an older neighborhood. There were many large trees that gave shade in the summer, and a wooded area behind the house, along with friendly neighbors and a genuinely placid calm overall. It was a nice place to live. There was not a hint that this house was haunted by an active, though unhappy ghost. As ghost implies, a frightening specter in my mind. I think I prefer the term spirit. The house haunting was confirmed to be human. The haunted did not begin immediately. Months passed, perhaps a year. It began unannounced. There was no warning of any kind, nor even a hint of warning from the landlord. What I recall is a very lovely late summer day. At 3 o'clock in the afternoon, our front entry door opened with a bang, and the loud chatter of swinging Venetian blinds. My wife and son were with me in our family room watching television. My daughter was serving in the military and was far off and unexpected. Our heads snapped sharply as we quickly looked at each other's faces, looking for a hint of understanding regarding of what was happening. There was none. 2 probabilities came to mind. The first being my daughter home on unexpected leave, with the intent of surprising us. The second was criminal home invasion. After a moment spent gathering my wits, I moved from the family room to the living room. I found our entry door wide open, the blinds which covered its window still swaying side to side. The door, for those prone to detail, opened inward. There was no apparent explanation for what had happened. That door was little used by our family and was kept locked. The door was rather difficult to open, as the door itself was simply stuck in the frame. It took a lot of effort to open, and when the door finally did, it popped free rather heavily, as a result of being stuck or jammed, and the force it took to open it, the metal Venetian blinds would swing and sway and clatter. In all, annoying enough that our front door was almost never used. After that first experience, things changed. The front door continued to open, although not frequently. The back door would also be found open from time to time. Bedroom doors opened much more frequently though, and one bedroom in particular. As we were never in fear, and there was no show of hostility, we accepted our new reality. There may also have been an occasional noise during the night, but nothing of real note. We simply adopted whoever this was and often spoke to them. We have simple greetings with conversation. This came to an end for us in 1998, when it was time to return to my work abroad. Movers came to take away our belongings. While this went on, the lady living next door spoke to me over the fence and asked if anything unusual happened during our stay. I affirmed that it had. Then she told me the following. A woman and her daughter lived in that house in the years past. The girl, a high school student, was 16 or 17 years of age. On New Year's Eve, the girl wanted to attend a party. The mother declined because of severe ice storms. The girl went anyway. The mother waited up to early hours for her daughter to return before crying herself to sleep. The mother was awakened by crying and discovered her daughter sitting in the chair next to her bed. The girl sobbed, "Oh mother, I'm so sorry, I'm so sorry." The girl repeated her statement and then vanished. After 3 days of searching, the girl's car was located upside down in a canal used by a local power company to produce electricity. The girl's body was in the car, which had slid off the icy road into the frozen canal. The woman who told me this was the sister of the girl's mother, making her the aunt of the girl. They had lived side by side as neighbors as well as relatives. I recall all of this with great clarity. This is a true and accurate presentation of what I had experienced. This happened several years ago in Calgary, Alberta, Canada. I was about 22 years old and working in a medical warehouse with 3 other staff. One of them had called in sick, so there was only 2 of us this day. We had half top floor and full bottom floor. Also, the front part of the office, which had an additional 8 staff, but they hardly came to the back of the warehouse, so we never saw them. We would call the other guy Dan. It was about 1 in the morning, and we were pulling orders out to be shipped. Dan was packing them and I was packing them as well. We were on a roll and almost complete of all the orders, when Dan had called up to the second floor, where I was. I had just put a pallet product up there weighing about 500 pounds. I had lowered and pulled the pallet jack out and lowered the jack, so it wouldn't roll away. Dan asked me to get a couple cases off the pallet. I walked to the end of the floor and looked down towards him. It was about 15 to 20 feet down. I'd asked Dan if I had heard him right, and he replied yes. He said, "Hurry up and then we'll give a smoke break and get some coffee." I was in the midst of telling him something. Then all of a sudden the pallet jack had moved. I looked behind me to see if someone was there, but to my surprise, there was no one. He shook his head, and just then, the jack moved about 5 feet all of a sudden. It got freaked out and I had noticed by the jack that it got dark, like a shadow of a person was there. Dan had asked me again who was up there. I told him it was just me and I couldn't see anybody but a shadow. He walked backwards to see if he could look up and see. I was looking at him, and then I blacked out all of a sudden. Jumping to what I had remembered and what Dan had told me, Dan came running up the stairs toward me, and I was laying on a broken pallet. I had scratches on my arms too. Dan was calling my name and trying to wake me. I looked up towards him and asked him what the heck happened. Dan told me, "You were looking down towards me and didn't look like yourself. Your eyes were black and you had a pale look. Then you had threatened me and started walking towards me with the look of hatred in your face. And then you fell over." We both got up and took off in a hurry. We got coffee and went back off to the warehouse. I felt very dizzy, drained, and exhausted all in the same time. I'm not sure what happened to me. Maybe one of you guys can explain it.
I'm not sure if this is what you would consider terrifying, but it is certainly bizarre. I don't know if it's astral projection, But what I do know is that many times throughout my life, I have left my body, usually during sleep, flying to unknown places. I met people on my journeys. They are usually folks that are in need of something. Let me preface this by saying I am a middle-aged man. I have had experiences with the paranormal all my life. I have dealt with the ghosts, demons, and angels. I know it sounds unbelievable, but it's true. During one of my out-of-body experiences, I was flying over Casper, Wyoming, when I literally slammed into a young lady who was also flying over the city. She told me she was sent to find me. I was a little more than confused, to be honest. I asked why she was sent to find me, and she replied her mother sent her because she needed my help. The next thing I know, my alarm clock was going off and I was back home. I just assumed I had dreamt the whole thing. 3 days later, my car stalls in front of a small apartment building. I go up to one of the units to see if I could use their phone to call my boyfriend. Now keep in mind, this is before cell phones were a thing. I knock on the door and nearly fall backwards in shock. The person standing at the door was the same girl I ran into before. She looked at me with the same look of shock and confusion and whispered my name. I simply nodded yes and said, "You must be Zoe." She invited me in and introduced me to her mother. Her mother was more than excited and bewildered to see me, as she had been looking for me. A friend of hers had told her that I could help her find a loved one she had been trying to find. I happened to know the loved one and was able to reconnect the two after nearly 10 years. Now fast forward about 5 years or so. I was living in Denver, Colorado, when I was once again out of my body and flying over the industrial part of the city when I landed in an alley. I met a woman with flaming red hair and was dressed in a leather-type catsuit. I will call her Joan for privacy's sake. Anyway, Joan told me God has sent me to help her with her ministry. She was a minister for the gay community at the time. I thought that was obscure considering I was a gay man, and why would God want me to help her ministry? Exactly 3 days later, I was at work waiting tables, when all of a sudden, guess who comes to the door of the restaurant but Joan. She walked right up to me and handed me her business card. She winked at me, called me by name, and insisted I call her after I got off of work. Out of curiosity, I did. I was apprehensive at first, but figured there had been a reason we had met 3 days after that event. Joan told me she had a dream. She was fishing and God spoke to her, telling her that she was about to reel in a fish, like she had never seen before. She said God told her I was exactly what she needed for her ministry. That's when I knew it was more than just a dream. I told Joan about my experiences with the paranormal and how I would meet others on these flights, and then meet them in person exactly 3 days later. Joan told me I was very prophetic and a gifted seer. I kind of laughed it off at first. She told me about her ministry and that she was a deliverance minister. She told me that she had dealt with demons, and that is why she needed me. I was uncomfortable with the idea, to say the least. I had what she called the gift of discernment. This is one of the reasons I was always under demonic attack, because they know I know their names, and that is why they had never been able to touch or harm me in any way. When I would have those run-ins with the demons, I would call them by name and send them away. Fast forward a few weeks, Joan asked me to sit in on a deliverance session she was going to have with a young drag queen from the neighborhood. I reluctantly agreed to do so. When I arrived, I was surprised to see that the drag queen was a coworker of mine. As the session began, this tiny little flamer of a guy began to speak in multiple voices. I literally began to climb the back of the couch and up the wall to get away from this guy. Joan began to talk to this demon, and demanded her to leave this young man. The demon hissed and laughed at her, telling her she had no authority. Joan spoke calmly yet firmly. She informed the demon its name gave her authority over it. Again, it laughed and mocked her. It refused to give her its name. Keep in mind, I'm still against the wall, watching all of this utter horror. This was not Hollywood. This was fucking real, and my heart was pounding so bad, I thought it would shatter my rib cage. Then, out of nowhere, the demon's name popped into my head. And without even a thought, I yelled out its name. That's when the realization of why I was there hit me like a freight train. I stepped off the couch and stood next to Joan. I was still shaking like a leaf, but again, I spoke the demon's name. Joan then continued with her deliverance session, and using the demon's name was able to drive it out of the poor little guy. Now I know this all sounds like something straight out of Hollywood, and I would rather it was. However, these are all actual and factual events. I have so many more stories to share with all of you, but that's saved for another time. Back to my original question. So is what I experienced while flying astral projection or something else? Can anybody help me figure this out?
One night, when I was around 8 or so, I'd gone to bed early. I had school in the morning, you know. I slept pretty good that night, all things considered, but woke up out of a sound sleep at some point in the wee hours of the morning. I did not have an alarm clock at this point in time, so there's no telling what time it was. All I knew was the sky was black outside my window. In any case, I woke up to this feeling of being watched. I thought it might be one of my little brothers standing by my bed, as they tend to come to me instead of my parents for comfort when they had nightmares in the middle of the night. Didn't feel any kind of threat, or scared in any kind of way, but I slowly cracked my eyes to see who was there. There was nothing. I opened my eyes all the way, and only then did I notice what looked like the outline of a thin, older man with glasses and a long-sleeved shirt on. The odd part was that this image was completely see-through, except for the outline of his body, glasses, and clothes, which glowed in several shades of blues and greens that shimmered and shifted like the northern lights. He just stood there, with a soft smile on his face, about a foot away from my bedside, just watching me. My father had been known to come in and check out his kids in the night sometimes, so I sleepily asked, "Papa?" Thinking this was the case. The next thing I knew, it was morning, and Mom was waking me up to get us all ready for the bus. I asked my dad if he checked on us during the night, but he denied it. He listened to my story, but said nothing in reply, probably chalking it up to my dreams or my imagination. But I know what I saw. Years later, I brought it up again at my dad's house, and he seemed to think it may have been the spirit of my great-great-grandfather, who'd passed away the month before I'd been born. Our great-great-grandma was still around, so when I had the chance, I asked her about her husband. She described a thin, spectacled man who was sweet as could be, always with a smile on his face. She proceeded to tell me that he passed away from lung cancer, but had he had the chance to meet us, he would have spoiled my brothers and I rotten. Knowing this, I'm certain that's who came to visit me that night. So back when I was in early college, there was this girl who hung out with my group of friends. She lived in a mobile home park. It's kind of like a trailer park, but they aren't trailers. Anyway, we were hanging out until pretty late, and we got to drop her off at home. She lived at the very back of the park, and the only road that's there does a weird roundabout to get out of the park. So after she gets inside, my friend who's driving just says screw that noise and just reverses back. It's like 1 or 2 a.m., so no one's going to be driving, so no biggie. While we were reversing, there was a girl outside walking the direction we were going. She was wearing a nightgown with no shoes or socks outside. Her hair was a mass and she was covered almost face to toe with what looked like blood and cuts. Her skin was pretty pale, but not unusual. While we reversed, she looked directly at us and she didn't even change her expression. We were dead silent in the car until we backed up far enough to turn around and get out of the park. When we finally stopped to turn, my buddy said, "You think we should have gave her a ride?" Me and my brother both said screw that and drove away.
This happened a few years back in BC, Canada, by the USA border at a place called Christina Lake. It's a small boating lake, and there are not many fish to catch in those waters, but the water is dark and murky, and it's a great place to go in the summer. My grandparents have a cabin there at the lake, and since I live in Vancouver, Canada, it takes a while to drive up there, maybe around 8 hours. But when we pull up, I can't wait for relaxation and peace. But what happened in this story was far from peaceful. On the 5th day we were there, my cousins were out swimming. It was late, and we were the only ones out on the dock and probably the entire area. We were jumping into the lake and swimming out as fast as we could. We were all pretending a tentacle would grab us and pull us under if we didn't. When it was my turn, I was hesitant, but as the youngest, I wanted to impress them, so I jumped. The water was absolutely freezing, and I surfaced instantly, out of breath, and just before I reached the dock ladder, I felt something brush my foot. I dismissed it as a fish, as the neighbors had a net under their dock. I kept feeling this brushing on my foot, and so I decided to go back inside, a little bit weirded out. The next morning while eating breakfast, I looked outside. It was a perfect day for swimming. We went to my aunt's cabin and started playing for the day. Nothing weird there, but when we decided to take the small boat back to our house, things really went downhill. We were rowing the boat, my cousin's brother and I, when we hit something. We assumed it must have been a log and kept rowing. I kept an eye out for swimmers and logs ahead. The sun shone brightly and I could see really far. In the distance, not too far away, I saw this black shape under the water, as it had just come up to skim the surface. It was too big to be a fish, but too small to be a person. And no child in their right mind would swim that far out alone, or else they'd risk drowning. We got back to the cabin and I had dinner, and I felt like going for a late swim. This time the entire family went down. I brought my swimming mask to try to see the bottom. I dived down and swam towards my grandparents slowly, seeing what I could under the water, and reaching out to see what I could feel. I felt something brush me like the night before, and I thought, hey, I might be able to see this fish now. So I dove deeper, only to surface screaming and bawling. When I got to the dock, my father asked me what was wrong, and I said, "What is that?" My poor dad, confused at my distress, got a mask and dove and surfaced, and told me that there was nothing there. Later that night I told my brother what had happened. After I went under, I saw something staring at me. It had bright yellow eyes and a fish-like body, but what will haunt my mind forever, what really makes this experience so terrifying, was the fact that, and I swear on this thing had the face of a person. When I looked at it, it looked back at me, and its human-like lips moved as if to speak to me, but I don't know what it said. I have no idea what I saw that day, and I hope I don't run into anything like it ever again. I still travel to that lake from time to time, but I haven't seen anything like it since. But I am looking forward to this summer. Maybe I'll have the courage to change my mind. Maybe one day I'll find it and understand what it was and where it came from.